Who should we believe? Should we believe what the Torah says or what the archaeological evidence shows? For example, the Exodus from Egypt. Did it really happen, or is it just a story we have from our ancestors in the Torah? We have as a guest someone who is an expert on this topic. I've already seen some of his talks in very high-level forums, which I'll tell you a bit about later. And welcome, Hacham Yaakob Bitton.
Thank you very much, Yaakob.
Thank you for agreeing. If you allow me, I'd like to tell the audience a bit about your background so people can get an impression of the topic. Besides being a lawyer, I saw your talks at the Ibn Sifragat Forum, which is a forum that, let's say, promotes Sephardic culture with a very high Torah standard and also an academic standard. Here, Hacham Bitton has a semicha from Yeshiva University, that is an ordination. He also has a master's degree in Talmud, also from the United States. The truth is, his main language isn't Spanish, so please be patient. If you don't understand any English terms, let us know in the comments and we'll explain them. And he lives in the United States, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me.
The first thing I would like to ask you is, what does archaeology say about Yetziat Mitzrayim? That is, about the Exodus from Egypt.
The popular opinion would say that archaeology has supposedly proven that the story of the Jewish people as told in the Torah is fiction. That hasn't happened. The most famous archaeologists of the Egyptian and Middle Eastern civilizations, many of them Jewish, take it for granted that the Exodus from Egypt did not take place. They insist on this opinion as if it were a dogma, a scientific position, as if it had already been scientifically established, which it hasn't. There is no evidence for that. And that's why it's important to make some things clear from the beginning, a priori about what archaeology is not, the limits. First of all, history is not a science. We must distinguish between history and science. Historians present as history theories that they may have, which are partly based on certain facts that have been found, but all they are giving us is an idea, a theory among many of what may have happened. There are clues are found, and a story is presented that fits those clues, but there could be many stories that would also fit the same clues. Historians choose one of those stories, but that doesn't mean the others aren't valid. And this is very important because historians will never tell you this. Historians, archaeologists, will always present their theories, their stories, as if they were science, the truth, the fact, as an objective, absolute truth that must be accepted and cannot be rejected. And you have to differentiate. History is not science.
What you're saying is one of my biggest discomforts with these kinds of so-called sciences. They call them sciences, but they're not exact sciences. For example, I'm an engineer, a chemical engineer. And there we're talking about a science that you can calculate, that you can prove, you can repeat the process and come to the conclusion that that's how it works. With history, this doesn't happen. And what surprises me is that in the academic field, there are many people who buy into this story. But I would like to ask then, along these lines, do you think there are any archaeologists who believe that these stories told in the Torah actually happened?
There are certain archaeologists who are indeed more sympathetic to the Jewish tradition, especially archaeologists from 50, 60, 70 years ago. At the beginning of archaeology, biblical archaeology, there was a greater sympathy, and many of the motivations of the archaeologists, who in many cases were religious Christians, were to establish the truth of the Torah. Lately, in recent decades, the most famous archaeologists are those who are more antagonistic and aim to prove that the events described in the Torah did not happen. That is their goal. And archaeology is a fascinating discipline. I love it. Archaeologists deserve a lot of credit for the artifacts they have discovered, unknown civilizations that they help us learn about. These are valuable findings that shouldn't be ignored. That's not what I'm saying. Don't get me wrong. They're very limited, and we must recognize those limits. There are limits to the amount of things that have been found. A large amount of items discovered in Egypt can't be catalogued. But in the pyramids and everywhere and in all the museums in the world, it's a huge amount. And it's the civilization that has been best preserved because of the dry climate of Egypt, which allows all the artifacts that have been found to be preserved. But on the other hand, we are trying to understand or learn about a civilization that is more than 3,000 years old. Over 3,000 years. Imagine the countless people who have lived there. See, if I asked you to give me a sample, a glimpse of your life, so that someone in 100 years could understand who you were and what you thought, how much would you have to show me? How much? Are the books you have behind you enough, or are they just a small part of your life? That's why there's a limit to the amount. Then there's the limit of reliability. Because let's say we find something that was written by someone in Egypt 3,500 years ago, and that person says ABC. How do I know if that person is trustworthy? How can I know the tone that person wanted to give to that event? It's impossible to know. And finally, there's interpretation, because everything that is found, there's the fact, the object, and then there's the story that's told about the object, which comes more from archaeologists and historians than from the object itself. So there are many limits that archaeologists normally aren't going to present to you.
I think it's a very good explanation so that the public can understand. We're talking about a period of thousands of years and trying to take a single piece to create an entire narrative, like trying to look for continuity. And it's true, there is more than one piece. But like the example you gave, how can you really give the interpretation? And this is where what you mentioned comes in about the agenda that the archaeologist might have. If an archaeologist has a specific approach, they'll present certain things. For those familiar with academic articles, one piece can yield 20 opinions on what it is, how it's represented, and how it relates to others. So I'd like to ask you then, someone, let's say an Orthodox Jew or a person, a Noahide, how should they feel or how should they react? When there are historians or archaeologists who claim that the development of the Tanakh, of the Torah, is false, how should we react to this then?
Yes, that's a very important question. Let me start by illustrating the problem with two examples and showing you how one should feel, how one should react to such an accusation. Suppose that a biological evolution theorist, a Darwinist, proposes that the grandfather of a common chicken is a type of carnivorous dinosaur, like they say in Jurassic Park. This too takes the form of a historical fact. It would be presented to you as if it were science, even though in reality it is just one interpretation among many of the facts that have been found. But he insists on that. The value of the theory will also depend on who is putting it forward. So if the journal that publishes that article is a very prestigious journal, it will have more value, and the opposite is also true. Um, The problem that this theory doesn't have is that he himself has no reason to be offended if they say his grandfather is a dinosaur. But let's change the example a bit. Imagine that this theorist comes to a community without any invitation and tells them with an air of authority that regardless of their beliefs about their family stories and traditions, all of them actually come from incestuous relationships between chimpanzees and pigs, and that there is archaeological evidence supporting this thesis. So the subject of the theory in this example should indeed be offended. What's the difference? The difference is as follows. The thesis being proposed is not offered in a vacuum, but rather as an alternative to the memory of this community. And that is the difference between a living tradition and a dead civilization. Theories you may have about Egypt. Egypt is a dead civilization. No one gets offended. No one has spoken Egyptian in almost 2,000 years. There is no memory. But treating the history of Israel, the Hebrew history of the Jewish people, as Egyptian history is offensive. Why? Because it assumes that there is no one who remembers or who is a reliable witness of what really happened. And we are here. That's why I agree with you that when archaeologists try to deny us our history, whatever the theory may be, our first reaction has to be one of offense. We know what happened to us, we have that memory, we remember it year after year, and we don't need proof. Just like I don't need a DNA test to know that my dad is my dad or my grandfather is my grandfather.
Look, for the audience that might not be very familiar with Judaism, we Jews are, I don't know how to say it in Spanish, pretty bold. which means we challenge a lot, even our teachers. In Judaism, when a rabbi makes a statement, we question it. It's not like in dictatorships, for example, academic ones, where a professor says something and it's almost like, and those who have been in a university environment know that there's even a risk in challenging the professor because that could cost you a grade, etc. That's why everything you say fits very well with Jewish thought, that even if an academic says it, you shouldn't just accept it blindly. I mean, in the aspect you just explained, I'm not really afraid of academic statements precisely because of everything you've just discussed. It's much more complex than just showing that there's a papyrus in an area from 3,000 years ago. In any case, my question, and on the other hand, I have a lot of respect, as you said, for these people who have dedicated their lives to studying. Being an archaeologist isn't easy, and it's even harder to be a scholar who truly knows extensive literature on the subject, the language, and can read hieroglyphics. Even so, despite all the respect we may have for these great minds, my question is, tell me, ¿qué, o sea, how should we see our version of these events if in any case they are the ones telling us that version? I mean, should we deny it? It's like a very thin line, you know what I mean?
Well, look, we're talking about very intelligent people who decided that the best use of their intellect, time, and efforts is to find ways to show the Jewish people that what we remember is incorrect, and therefore that's the second step. Maybe they don't say it explicitly, but that's what's implied. Our identity is worth nothing. That's the bottom line, that's the final conclusion. And that's something you don't do unless there's some deeply rooted ideological pathology at play. So what do you have to ask yourself when you're attacked by archaeologists, who again aren't nearly as obsessed with proving that a certain theory about what happened in ancient Greece is wrong? It's an approach, it's an obsession, it's an amount of energy spent trying to prove that the Torah is wrong. That's pathological. And you have to ask yourself with a psychologist's hat rather than a scientist's hat, why? What bothers you so much? Why are you so determined to prove that? Are they really that sure of their findings? Are they being honest when they present something as science? Or do they have some kind of agenda? Maybe they're more interested in the theory's implications than in what they're proposing. Before we use our own time and spend our energy refuting them, let's understand that. Let's understand that we're being attacked by people with an agenda, by people with certain biases who really want to deny us our right to remember, our right to have our own memory. Now, as we wrap up, let's say there are facts. There are the pyramids, there are the mummies, there are the monuments, there are many archaeological findings to take into account. I'll give you another example. Let's say that for breakfast you ate pancakes. And you know it, you remember it, and without anyone inviting him, your neighbor comes and says, Yaakob, I think you haven't eaten pancakes, and I'm going to prove it to you. And without being invited, without you giving him permission, he goes to your trash, starts looking and says, look, I didn't find any eggshells. That means you haven't eaten pancakes. And it's proven, it's scientific. It's a scientific fact now that you haven't eaten pancakes. It's exactly the same because you remember, you have your own memory and you know what happened and you trust your own memory. You don't need to see the proof from the eggshells. Now, let's say that fact exists. There's also the fact that your trash can has no eggshells. How do you reconcile that with your memory of having eaten pancakes? That's the question we also have to answer with Yetziat Mitzrayim, with the sojourn in Egypt. Look, there are a lot of theories you could say, you know why? Because this is actually a new trash can. The previous one had the eggshells, could be. Or maybe you threw them somewhere else. That could be too. There are a lot of theories. The same with Egypt. You can take into account the archaeological facts. You can take into account the artifacts that have been found and try to reconcile, try to find some harmony between our memory and what archaeological findings show. It's very possible Again, archaeology is very limited. It gives clues, and there are thousands and thousands of theories that could be exist. The same goes for Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Yes, in fact, the example you mentioned is not far-fetched at all. There are very prestigious academics who use exactly that argument. For example, and he already speaks Spanish, he was the curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Museum, Professor Reutemann. In his book, he writes that the ethos of the Exodus from Egypt is so significant that it's not possible that it didn't happen. Now, in his academic view, he says that this core of truth is so significant. That's what he questions. But he doesn't question the fact that it happened. So there are many approaches. I say this to anyone afraid to read a book like Israel Finkelstein's from 15 years ago. By the way, whether it's by Israel Finkelstein or someone else, I'm currently working on my master's degree, where there are top scholars in this field. Israel Finkelstein, author of The Bible Unearthed 15 years ago, has since changed his positions over the past decade and a half. That is to say, this is impressive. But in November 3 years ago, I heard Israel Finkelstein saying, should we believe in the Exodus from Egypt? He gave a whole talk about reasons why not, recent discoveries, updates, and concluded by saying, Jews should treat the Exodus from Egypt as real and remember it annually. That blew my mind. I mean, these things aren't black and white. So I'm saying this for the audience, and that would be my last question to wrap up, Yaakob Bitton. What approach would you recommend to people who want to stay true to the national tradition in the case of Jews, or to people who want to stay true to Hashem, to what the Torah says? However, also consider the archaeological findings.
We have to rely on our memory. There is personal memory and there is also national memory. Each nation has its memory, it has its own memories, things it remembers and preserves from generation to generation. Look, what Am Yisrael has done day after day, with every mitzvah we do, with every commemoration, every holiday we have, is to remember the Exodus from Egypt. That is our memory, what we must remember. One more thing before I forget. Not every little detail about the story of the Exodus from Egypt and all that is an essential part of our memory. For example, in what year did the Exodus from Egypt happen? Yisrael, the Jewish people, don't have a clear memory of that. There are cultural reasons for that. The most important cultural reason is that the obsession with knowing in what year something happened is a pretty modern, pretty new, and quite Western obsession. If you look at the Tanakh, the Bible, it never talks about absolute years. They're always relative years. The such and such year of such and such king, because nobody ever cared about that. The first time that la primera time in history when humanity cared about an absolute count of time was with Alexander the Great, which started after his life, when the Greek calendar began, which counted in an absolute way without considering which civilization we were talking about. Always the same count, always the same years. But until then, the ways of counting time were always fairly relative. The count we have of Briata Olam, since the world was created, since Adam Harishon was created, which today would be 5,785 years, is a fairly new count. It's from the time of the Geonim. Before that, years were not counted in that way. So that's an example of a detail that is not part of our memory. But the things that are part of our memory, for example, that we left Egypt, that we were at Har Sinai, that we received the Torah, are things that we have preserved, and we should trust our memory first and foremost. Archaeological facts are, from my point of view, a curiosity, as it is said in the Brit Parparot, the Hojma. They are accessories, they are details, they are ornaments that one can add to memory. And if we have to defend ourselves, that's fine, we'll take it more into account. But going back to the example of what you ate, what you had for breakfast, you ate pancakes and you know it. Whether you find the eggshells afterward or not, that's secondary. And I wouldn't recommend spending all your time trying to find those eggshells.
I understand. Interesting. Actually, yes. Even this counting of the Geonim, there are even books like Seder Olam that make a distinction. Well, anyway. But I would like to close with this message that I think is important. I have an article on this topic about what you said, that there is no one who preserves the memory of the Egyptians. Only Israel preserves the memory of Israel, but I have an opposing argument. If someone wants to get a feel for the Egyptian, they should go to a Jew. Because we Jews are the ones who preserve, like in a time capsule, within ourselves. Look, blowing a shofar, putting on tefillin, gentlemen, these things did not begin yesterday. These are truly ancient things. Thank you, Yaakob Bitton, for joining us. We send you our warm regards and thank you for listening.
A pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Shavua Tov.
Shavuot Tov.